Hey,
Hey Brent, how are you doing?
oh, feeling rough today.
Yeah, I can relate to that. But hey, thanks for reaching out. It was funny. I was literally thinking in the days prior to getting your Facebook message, wow, I'd love to talk to Brent Cooper, and
Cool.
I've just been listening to I had been listening to some of the podcasts and conversations you've been having, and I was like, man, I wish I was involved in that. So then you messaged me, and I was like, great,
Well,
let's talk.
yeah, anybody can talk to me.
Mhm.
I don't have a lot of people to talk to, and I've made lots of enemies.
Yeah,
So,
hard,
yeah,
it's hard
so
not to do that in this climate, in this political
yeah,
climate. Uh,
yeah, so I'm reaching out to people, and yeah, you seem like a good, critical, fruitful collaborator,
hmm,
and yeah, and you and a few other people, like, you already put up your own YouTube videos, right? And I don't do that. I also don't teach. But for me to, be effective and also like grow, I have to sort of create that opportunity for myself. Like, I need to start practicing.
yeah, well, I love dialogue. It's there's dialogue, there's dialectic, and then there's
Yeah,
oscillation, and right there's all these ways of arriving at truth and virtuous action. But dialogue for me is the core of it all, because if there is such a thing as politics, if there is to be such a thing as a polis where everyone's a citizen and we can all engage in the agora, in the public sphere, and arrive at the most ideal shared future, and how to achieve that, um, it's going to be through dialogue. And we have to learn to do it and cultivate it and provide everyone with the opportunity to cultivate and to
yeah,
do it.
yeah. And I need to cultivate it and practice it, but I'm also critical of it. Like I'm critical of a lot of the conversations happening, right? Especially, kind of starting with the IDW as kind of the, like, self-defined gold standard
Yeah,
for
yeah.
conversations. Like, I just think it's bullshit. And
It's debate. I think they're still stuck in the
it's not
paradigm
even
of debate, I
it's not
think,
even
instead of,
debate. It's,
yeah.
yeah, it's a little bit of that, but it's not even debate, because there are debates out there, right? And so there's a lot of leftist debate, like, I follow a lot of YouTube channels, and on both sides, people reach out to each other and actually engage and debate. And that's not what the IDW did. It was kind of a centrist experiment, right? In whatever, free and open conversation, but it was, pretty self-serving, a lot of backpatting. They did criticize each other sometimes, but it didn't work, and so that needs to be acknowledged too.
Mhm.
Like, we can't give them credit for anything really, because what did they accomplish? They helped traffic Dave Rubin over to the far right,
Yeah, wow.
where he's now collecting increasingly fatter paychecks to say dumber things.
Yep. Hmm. Hmm.
um so yeah, and yeah, I have like anxiety issues and, unemployment issues, so I don't feel welcome in a lot of conversations.
Uh-huh.
um, and then when I do voice my concerns, right, that's not kind of processed into that dialectic, right, and
Hmm.
it's at,
Hmm.
at, at the expense of a higher signal.
So you say you've made a lot of enemies,
Yeah,
because of criticisms that you've made, and are these enemies typically in like the integral, self-identified integral communities, or is there another set of folks that you seem to have upset, especially uh, through your criticisms? I'm just trying to get a sense for. I mean, speaking of conversations, I'd like to hear your answer to that question, but we didn't really talk about the format of this, and I don't know if you wanted there to be some off the record conversation about that, or just it's already been recording, so we've been on record, and uh,
right.
I'm fine with that. But it might be helpful, just given different audiences that might eventually listen to this, who don't know who you are, and who don't know who I am, it might be helpful to say a little bit about what brought you to this conversation, um, and I could say a little bit about myself and how I orient uh, to a conversation with you in particular. But I don't know. I think that would be a helpful place to start, and then we can kind of get into uh, some deep ideas, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. Usually I like to talk off the record first.
Okay.
Like you can record, and you can post it, or we can not post it. Like at
Hmm.
this point, I think a lot of these videos aren't being watched. So I
Hmm.
I don't care. I have nothing to hide. It's just like, is it interesting to people? I don't know. This is why I don't record my own videos and put them up. I've
Hmm.
been producing stuff, but I don't have a monologue
Yeah.
necessarily. And I want to connect with an audience. I don't just want to keep
Right.
keep talking into the void. um
Hmm. So I guess in
uh,
the effort of trying to connect to an audience, that's I guess what I was trying to
yeah.
suggest, is that we um, orient ourselves to this conversation to include people that we've already been in conversation with, and yeah.
Yeah, a lot of my enemies, as I put it, are centrists, whether they're integral or not.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of integralists are centrists. And I've had this conversation with laymen. We recorded a couple videos. I put one of them up at least. It was kind of our introduction to the Teal New Deal project, and that was
Mm-hmm.
that was an idea that was kind of, you know um I don't want to say of the moment, because it's an ongoing thing. Like it's been in development for a few months, but it's also kind of just on the back burner for now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's clearly kind of a thing that has to happen. I think integral is stale, with a few exceptions, like
Mm-hmm.
the people in the integral left kind of group, community. It's pretty small relatively, but they're the only ones making sense to me. And so, it's kind of incumbent on integralists, and I'm not an integralist, right? I don't think I ever will be at this point, because like I get it, I've studied it, but I'm not part of the community. And like I said, with the centrists, it just puts me off, because I have a background in like political sociology and like actual kind of, historical literacy, and kind of policy literacy of this kind of stuff. And I'm far from an expert, because a lot of it is just really like Byzantine and complex, like policy, especially like when you actually get to the fine print of a policy, whether it's good or bad. It's like, well, what the fuck am I reading? It's just, and so I think more abstractly, and I value an abstract turn going in that direction of, plainer language, and like, really codifying ideals, whether it's like Medicare for all or the Green New Deal. Like
Mm-hmm.
these are relatively simple, universal, progressive platforms. But in the discourse, they get highly politicized,
Mm-hmm.
one way or another. And so, yeah, I don't have any patience for that bullshit. Like,
Right.
um, and it's got to be a team effort. So, part of what I'm trying to do in my long game is build consensus.
Hmm.
Right? And this has been a major point of frustration for me in like the emerge community,
Uh-huh.
because they just don't want to have it. They don't want to hear it. They want a kind of hyper pluralism, which is very postmodern,
Mm-hmm.
and they want to be very like inactive. Like they want to, slowly build up a kind of discourse and a network, so that it might do something someday.
Uh-huh.
But with the Bernie Sanders movement, twice in a row now, um, you know, we're going to continue to push, but that was a historic opportunity that's completely been, not just lost or missed, but sabotaged.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I've been kind of, on the receiving end of a lot of the indifference or scorn, towards that
Mm-hmm.
movement, you know.
I still haven't fully mourned the loss of Bernie Sanders as a
Yeah.
candidate for president.
Well, and he's still active, right? This is what people don't get
Of
is,
course.
the 2016 election was depressing. Like the hardcore burners like myself were let down because in the final instance, like we wanted to keep pushing. We wanted a contested convention, like for, we didn't believe Hillary could win, and then, Bernie kind of capitulated and then campaigned for her. And it's just so tragic, right? It's so tragic because Bernie is kind of more pure than all of us, and he did what he thought was best, and the world let him down. He was stabbed in the back, and he turned around and kind of did what he thought he had to do for the greater good. But my point is, after that, right,
Mm-hmm.
between the elections, before he announced his second run, he didn't stop. He was leading the campaign for $15 an hour minimum wage. Like,
Of course,
you
he's shifted the bar of what's possible so far to the left in such a short period of
yeah.
time that
So he doesn't get the credit.
He deserves thanks for that, even if he didn't
Yeah.
win the nomination or the presidency.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of truth to the sabotage narrative that of course the DNC was all in for Hillary before the race even started in 2016. And of course the DNC did not want, they were anybody but Bernie in the 2020 primary. And only a centrist fool would deny that. But I also think there's something to the generational divide, particularly among African Americans, that prevented Bernie from winning the nomination both times. And that's an interesting dynamic. People will often say he didn't win the black vote, but he didn't win the 35 and older black vote. And so there was, Joe Biden only became the nominee because of that dynamic. And so there's more to the story than just sabotage for Bernie. Because what if Bernie does sweep the South after Nevada? Why didn't he do that? What was the disconnect between Bernie Sanders and the older black voters?
Yeah. I can think of like 100 different explanations for why he was defeated.
Yeah.
So we could go through some of them, but like my complaint when it comes to kind of our intellectual circles, our who's adjacent, contemporary, is like, the response from so-called intellectuals, right? So you have the kind of typical leftists, right? Like Cornel West, like Chris Hedges, Noam Chomsky, we're all in for Bernie. Mm-hmm. But, there's a crisis in intellectualism, right? The New York Times, right? All these writers and editors are just like anti-intellectual. And then, within Emerge, within Integral, within, the intellectual dark web, there's just not a lot of literacy of that. They're perpetuating the culture war.
Journalism has to be anti-intellectual by its very nature. I mean, it's trying to reach as wide of an audience as possible. And I think that's a good role for journalism to play, to be anti-intellectual. But I think intellectuals need to do a better job becoming understood by wider groups of people. And that means expanding educational opportunities ultimately, so that we don't, have a disconnect between people who consume information or knowledge and people who produce knowledge. We should all be knowledge producers. We should all be equipped to be participants in the knowledge economy, to put it in a crude way. But so, we could get into the minutia of the Bernie Sanders primary issue, but I think to back up a few steps when you were talking about wanting to be a consensus builder, I think that's the role that I'd like to play too in these conversations, which is a kind of centrism, isn't it? Interestingly enough, I mean, you're trying to find a reasonable center. Maybe it's not the center of 20th century politics, it's the center of some future situation. I mean, I heard you say in this conversation you had with the students in Moscow that you would like to see history progress one step at a time, left, right, left, right. I was like, okay, good. Yeah, there needs to be a dialectic here, but we need a more worthy right
Yeah.
people on the, and a more worthy left, I think. I think there are pathologies on both sides of the political spectrum, and that's why there's so much discord and polarization. And so we need to move towards consensus.
Yeah. The
And
way I've been framing it though is like there's three sides,
mhm,
there's a kind of like socialist left, and then there's a neoliberal center,
mhm.
and then there's a crazy right. It doesn't matter, like
Nativist,
there's different
yeah.
varieties, yeah.
Mhm,
But by and large the dominant trend, right, like has become Trumpism, right? Trump is just the figurehead, but we can't deny that the Republicans have embraced that,
mhm.
right? And leaned into it, and the Democrats have capitulated to it. So anybody who says both sides, unless they're just condemning those two kind of right-wing sides, like right-wing Democrats and then Republicans,
Yeah.
they're nuts. They don't have political literacy, and this has been a critique I make against people in Emerge. But that aside, going back to consensus building, my experience has been, and maybe you feel the same, is that as soon as you raise the topic, people, people get anxious. The hair on their neck stands up. They get defensive. They don't believe it's possible. They don't even want to talk about it. And I don't think that's just me. Like, so, my feelings being kind of ignored and maligned is not about me per se, because this is how the Bernie movement as a whole has been treated, right? Like
Mhm,
there was a Bernie blackout media wise the entire time, right?
mhm.
And Vice produced a documentary like a month ago called Bernie Blackout. And, like the people who were like on the fence about Bernie or just think that politics doesn't matter, they weren't paying attention to that kind of stuff. And they weren't getting their information through trustworthy sources, right? And this is what I'm talking about with anti-intellectuals for the New York Times, like David Brooks. Like David
Mhm.
Brooks is lauded as an intellectual, but he's not. He's not.
Yeah.
He's a dilettante. He's a pedant, and he's very wealthy and very experienced at writing op-eds. That's it. He's not a clear thinker. He's not transpartisan. He's a a centrist loyalist, and a pretty unimaginative one at that. So when I talk about intellectuals, and I hold a very high standard for all of us, like we have to be, like consensually unilaterally anti-war, right? And this means
Mhm.
like anti propaganda, anti anti the kind of contrarianism, and all these discourses that perpetuate the nonsense in our public discourse.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, the consensus I want to build is around like pretty objective things, right? Like climate change and demilitarization, and consensus building itself, conflict
Mhm.
resolution,
Right.
because I don't hear anybody proposing these types of things. And
Yeah.
I've got some research and I've got some ideas on how that, what that process would look like.
Yeah. Or even something like truth and reconciliation or restorative justice or
Exactly. That
Mhm.
like that's one of my favorite kind of concepts and terms. I bring it up a lot because you don't hear it very often, and usually truth and reconciliation happens after a major crisis.
Yeah.
But like this is the paradox of the US. Like it's been built on crisis and
Right.
on
As yeah. Mhm.
exploitation and inequality. It's always needed a truth and reconciliation commission for these things. It needs that kind of bold,
It's needed that
um
since the 17th century.
yeah. And if we do it, it can work, right? Like the truth and reconciliation commissions for like the Holocaust and stuff, like it's a big public metanoia. You get all these things out in the open
Yeah.
on the record, and you indict and criminalize the actual bad guys, the Nazis, and a lot of that Nazi culture, um
Yeah.
it both came from the US and it went back to the US, right?
Mhm.
Like in
Mhm.
terms of the historical narrative of American exceptionalism,
Yeah. imperialism.
They appeased, you know, the fascists before the war, and then finally everybody stepped up and there was a World War II, right? And you know, we shouldn't glamorize that too much, like, or
Right.
oversimplify.
But again, we think of that war as two sides,
Yeah,
the Allied powers and the Nazis, but IBM was on both sides, right? The transnational corporations were already playing nations against each other
yeah,
in global warfare that's been ongoing
yeah,
since, you know,
exactly.
it's never stopped. We've never not been in World War III. It started
Yeah.
many decades ago.
Yeah. And so for me, the way I frame like metamodernism and hypermodernism, you know, this is jumping to a really high level, but just to connect it with war, like, you know, the post-war period up until like 1990 roughly was the Cold War. And it's just all these things are so taken for granted. Like, oh, it's just history. This is, you know, and we have to win. But that's not, you
We have
know,
to win. America always wins. That's one of my favorite Trump lines last
yeah.
week.
But then you have the 90s as like this interwar period, right? Because as soon as, well, before 9/11 happened, right, there's Middle East war plans. So there's a kind of determinism there. And then, you know, the past 2 decades have been, you know, shaped by this overarching context of the war on terror. And it's not nothing, right? Like you can go live your life and ignore it, right? And that's kind of the point. Is like they're ostensibly out there to, you know, work for your freedoms. But
Yeah. Well, I
yeah,
mean, even before, you know, George Bush II became president and the whole Project for a New American Century, you know, had the plan for a new American dominance in the Middle East. I mean, George Bush I had already, you know, launched the first Gulf War that
right.
Clinton continued just with missile strikes instead of troops on the ground. And so the war in the Middle
Yeah.
East has been going on for forever, for
Yeah, it
decades
didn't,
longer
yeah.
than we usually would think of it, or than the dominant media narrative would lead us to believe. And even if we only date the beginning to 2003,
Yeah.
it's like, holy shit, it's been 17 years.
Right.
And we're still in these countries, and people are, well, in Iraq, all we did was give Iran more power. So that didn't work out as well as we hoped. And in Afghanistan, there's a figurehead government, and the Taliban as strong as ever.
Yeah.
So,
And David Brooks was one of the champions of the Iraq War. So we shouldn't be listening to those people ever.
yeah, the New York Times is frustrating to me, because
Yeah.
there's this, Trump has totally owned and dominated all of the media. I mean, and to the extent that he has literally managed to make all of the major media networks and newspapers do free advertising for him all day, every day. And only very recently, maybe, has that dynamic shifted, because now I think there's a dramatic, meaning 10 to 15% in the US population, a shift in public opinion about Trump because of just how quickly he was willing to send the military to put the whole country under martial law.
Yeah.
And I think that made a lot of people uncomfortable, you know. So I think with people like Romney and Bush coming out and saying, I'm not going to vote for him,
Mm-mm.
that's going to give 10 to 15% of Republicans who did vote for Trump second thought. And it's just a matter of, well, I don't know what the dynamic of Biden versus Trump on stage debating is going to be like.
It's going to be a joke.
It's going to be, I think it's, in a way, it's like America's highest form of art, comedy, and tragedy, all wrapped up in one. Because you know what Trump's tactics are going to be, and what's Biden going to do? Like, play tough like he's been trying and say, I'm going to punch you in the face. I mean, what's he supposed to do when Trump questions whether he's in like late stage dementia or something?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that dynamic could shift. The debates will shift the public perception, right? That's seems to be ballooning right now. I would imagine, but um, so I mean, one way that I think about the consensus building that you're talking about is as a form of ontological, not pluralism, ontological diplomacy is the word I meant to say. So there's a pluralistic dimension to it, perhaps, but it's not just pluralistic. It's seeking consensus, particularly social and political consensus. And so, I mean, one of the things I'd love to talk to you about, you know, you're coming out of a sociological background, and I come out of a philosophical academic background, and so I always feel like I feel politically driven to be politically engaged and active, and yet, you know, I have not been on the street in this recent set of rebellions and revolts that have been unfolding. You know, I just don't. I have to say, afforded the privilege to not live in an area where it's happening, and to not. I don't have my immediate circumstance doesn't compel me, you know, to be there. I have a job and I have to keep up with it, and I can't
Yeah.
travel, you know,
Yeah.
to go protest for a week, even though in the past, you know, with Occupy and with other Black Lives Matter
Yeah.
protests in the last several years, and the anti-war movement when I was in high school for the Iraq War, and you know, as a younger person, putting my body on the line was just, I was there already, living in the cities and the, you know.
Hmm.
So, but now it feels like I'm afforded the privilege to do something else. I hope that's also a value, which is to be an educator and to be a philosopher, and hopefully a public philosopher, a real intellectual, I hope, uh,
Yeah.
who can communicate effectively to bring people into agreement about the most important things.
Yeah.
Um, and so ontological diplomacy is a way of bringing people into agreement about the most important things. And so for me, the question whether you're on the left or the right of whatever political spectrum at whatever historical moment, we can all agree on certain, I think we can all agree on certain spiritual truths, or religious. So I think it's even important to use that word. There are certain religious truths that 95% of human beings, and even atheists, don't realize they're just as religious as everybody else. These religious intuitions that guide and shape our behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's this basic question for me in a neoliberal cultural and economic and political context, where we're basically taught that we're like space-time worms, which is to say that we are merely bioeconomic cogs in a machine, and that our true purpose is to serve the growth of capitalism, because we are human capital stock, and
Hmm.
capital, the most important thing under this neoliberal worldview is that the economy, the capitalist economy, grows, and that there are more billionaires. Um, rather than thinking of ourselves as just these cogs in a machine, though, what if there's a shared human spiritual intuition of our participation in the infinite, and of our we are creative repetitions of an infinite creator, if you will, and that if history does progress towards something more ideal, it's because eternity is present, you know,
Yeah.
in each moment of our experience. And so when we evoke these types of spiritual intuitions, I think it doesn't, we don't transcend politics and political disagreements or social and racial rifts and collective historical traumas. We don't just escape it, but we at least find a point of
Yeah.
contact where we can all share something deeper,
Yeah.
and from
And
there maybe begin restoration or healing, or uh,
yeah.
building consensus on more specific problems, you
All
know.
that's it's pretty unproblematic for me. I think it does become like it can go in different ways for other people, and this is where
Mm-hmm.
I think I am integral, right? But I don't identify with the brand or the movement. But but I suppose this is what Integral is trying to do, right? The way you just framed it. And like I said, I have no problem with that. I feel like I already embody it, kind of like I have kind of a post-secular worldview, right? So I've been through kind of the spiritual journeys and the different world religions, and then you come back to a kind of place of abstraction that you just, you understand all that religion is socially constructed and, has interesting history and philosophy and all that, but that at the end of the day, we're just like beings, and that we are united by that kind of cosmopolitan horizon, and that a lot of people already know this, whether it's explicit for them or not, right? And so we all want we all want world peace, but the thing is, I want to build consensus around like political literacy and like political action specifically, because so many of these intellectuals in our circles kind of eschew that, right? They say, oh, we need to go beyond, and I'm above that, but they're not, right? They're not paying attention at the granular level of detail that maybe we are. They're not paying attention to what the Bernie platform is, what happened to the Bernie Sanders movement, etc. And so there's already, sort of philosophical precedent for consensus, like the concept of consilience, right? And I feel like a lot of integral theory kind of, bastardizes that in their attempt to be post-political, right? So if I'm to like really, point the finger at somebody, let's say Ken Wilber, you can look at Ken Wilber unproblematically and admire him, but then if you think critically on the level that I am, and or just in the frame, it doesn't have to be that I'm at a higher level, but my frame of the intellectual dark web, right, and of politics, Wilbur either should not be speaking on those subjects at all, or he should open himself up to criticism or other sources, right? Instead, what we see is a kind of like curation and a kind of like a scripted, kind of discourse about it that like says all the IDW are second tier. And this is just really naive because, the problems of that language aside, it's naive because the base of the intellectual dark web is right wing and centrist, right? And this is like stuff that like even Peterson himself doesn't get. Like he dog whistles and he has right wing politics, but then he's like, well, I don't know why there's so many white men, young white men attracted to my talks. Oh, that's interesting. It's like, no, you fucking idiot. There's neo-Nazis in your audience. And so it's like, I'm just like, I don't see why I should have to be patient with all of this. Like I've respectfully criticized a lot of it, and so is the left. But there's no osmosis. There's no dialogue, as we're trying to foster between the left and the center. And so it's a kind of toxic mess because you have this this left-right pathology between the center and the right. Like Hillary Clinton is a centrist, Joe Biden is a centrist, and they're the wrong kind of centrist. They're third way neoliberals, and so is Ken Wilber to some extent, even if he's a mildly critical. So I feel like the integral consensus building project has kind of failed.
Yeah.
It needs to,
well, the whole idea of being post-political is laughable and dangerous. It's like the idea of being post-religious. Because there's a certain narrative about what religion is. And it's the narrative of people like Richard Dawkins, who's, he was professor of the public understanding of science at Oxford, I think, right? It's a narrative that treats religion as sort of a mind virus, and that it should be eliminated and replaced by more scientific ways of understanding. And there's a way in which Marx gave rise to that attitude in some ways, and that his notion that religion is just a social construct or the opiate of the masses. I mean, the problem with that reading is that, religion can serve a conservative political function. There's no question. And there's just as many examples of religion serving a politically radical agenda. But to say that religion
Yeah.
is just a social construct, I think there's another reading of religion, which is one that I've written about and tried to develop, which is that it's a cosmological expression. It's fully natural, if we want to use a modern term. It's not just social, but it's, nature and society are these abstractions that can be useful in conversation and dialogue and thinking, but they're not like, somehow religion emerged out of the universe and human beings emerged out of the universe. So our consciousness, our religion, and our science are cosmological products. And so, opium is not a social construct, right? If
Yeah.
opium is the excretion of a plant and it gets you high, and that altered consciousness can actually help you connect the dots or write great poetry at least. So religion is more than just a social construct, I think. But when we become spiritual, when we activate those intuitions, that doesn't make us post-political. There are, I think, good reasons for thinking that there are political ramifications of really connecting with these spiritual intuitions, not just as individuals, but really as communities. When we come together around these intuitions, certain political consequences follow, and they look a lot like, I don't know, ecosocialism, to use just an abstraction that I think generally can be understood, right? It
Yeah.
looks a
That's
lot
what,
like
yeah.
the early Christian community around
Yeah.
Jesus.
That's the term I use too.
Yeah.
Eco-social and socialism, and Vermeulen and Van den Acker use it too.
Yeah.
Like
So
we
so that
should,
would mean
yeah.
if you're a Ken Wilber and you want to foster this type of spiritual consciousness, you should totally be behind someone like Bernie Sanders,
Yeah.
because in politics, there are a lot of things, like you've said, that I would want to change about the way that Bernie Sanders ran his campaign and the way that he tried to insert himself into certain conversations and not others. What he did with Medicare for All was extremely effective. And the stuff around free college tuition, extremely effective. Student loan debt and all that. But when it came to race, I don't think he was very good at talking about it.
Yeah.
When it came to socialism, I don't think he was very good at talking about it.
Agreed.
And that he shouldn't have been defending Fidel Castro a week before voting started and expecting Americans to remember that only a few years earlier, Barack Obama had said the same damn thing. And
Right.
but at the end of the day, there has never been a point in American history where it was more obvious and necessary for us to stop allowing the private insurance companies from holding us hostage, to stop allowing the drug companies to hold us hostage, when every other country, democracy in the world, has some form of socialized medicine. And Bernie, the Medicare for All proposal isn't even as socialist as the UK,
Right.
which is why some people have been saying, kind of tongue in cheek, that Boris Johnson is to the left of Joe Biden on healthcare, because even he has to defend the
Right.
NHS, the National Health Service, which is way more socialist than what Bernie's proposing. The government actually pays the doctor, they employ the doctors and they own the hospitals. But Bernie's just proposing that the government owns the insurance plan. The hospitals and the doctors and the medical industry continues to be private.
Yeah.
All of Bernie's proposals are this sort of, he's an FDR Democrat. Why he insists on calling himself a socialist doesn't, I support him fully, but he's not really, he's a socialist in comparison to neoliberalism,
Yeah.
but he's not actually a socialist. He's not trying to eliminate the free market. He's trying to take certain things out of the free market because they're immiserating millions of people, by privatizing healthcare and education and
Yeah.
the food industry. He was getting into the problems with our agricultural system, and the whole Green New Deal. These are obvious things that should have been, that any sane person needs to be in support of right now. And for someone to claim to be post-political and not go all in with someone like Bernie, I think is a huge moral failing.
It's a very privileged position to take, right? And you can be wealthy and privileged and still be wise enough to advocate for that sort of socialism, but that's not what we've seen, right? We've seen a lot of this, so like this post political move. And there's no pure socialism anyways, and there shouldn't be, but I like the term socialism because it's based on the social. I'm not so concerned about how workers own the company, like that's a fucking abstraction from the 1800s. I'm interested in how like society distributes the kind of the money and healthcare and security more evenly and for society, right? So investing in society and the social and the sociological being the organizing principle as opposed to capital being the organizing principle, right?
Right.
So for me, it's very simple, right? And also like Einstein was a socialist, right? George Orwell was a socialist. Like we need to stop debating these terms like that allows people to distort what they mean.
Mm-hmm.
Because fundamentally, like, yeah, it's politicized, and we need to go in more socialist directions.
So,
And some things should be completely socialized, like
right.
healthcare. And if there wants to be some private companies, I don't care, but they cannot eat from the public pie.
Yeah.
That that's a non-starter for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there to think we need to think in as concrete terms as possible when we try to imagine a future just economy, and terms like worker and consumer and company and the whole idea of a job, and the way that presidential and political candidates talk about creating jobs all the time, like
Yeah.
because the thing is, like, more oil and gas jobs are not contributing anything positive to society at this point. More police officers are not contributing anything. More jails, and jailers, and they're not contributing anything to society. So jobs is not really the abstraction that we need to be orienting ourselves around when we talk about our political needs.
Yeah.
Because we need a new political language, I think. And I'm not even sure if terms like public and private, I mean, obviously I in the current type of discourse would be against the privatization of, even though I work at a private school, it's a nonprofit, but I wouldn't want education to be privatized.
Yeah.
I don't want private health insurance companies stealing people's money and determining what treatments the doctor's allowed to perform. And, I don't want privatization. I want things to be public. But at the same time, I wonder if the whole private public dichotomy isn't all too modern, in a sense of being stuck in a kind of Enlightenment conception of what the human being is and
Yeah.
how we organize ourselves socially. So I don't know really what the new abstractions are. Other than, I guess, the idea of Gaia, and an earth community, and moving beyond just a sense of the human, though of course human rights are important, and we need to not rush to universalize some abstract conception of what the human is, because that typically ends up looking like a white man. But I think there are abstractions like Gaia, which in a sense is an attempt to point us back to something concrete, which is our earthly entanglement as biophysical beings. And maybe there's a spiritual component to that too. But so I don't know, Gaia is one idea. I'm not attached to it, but I think we need different abstractions to talk about individuals and their relationship to society and the public-private thing.
Yeah. And for better or worse, I think I'm a little bit ahead of the curve on that, because like I don't have a job. And I don't, I'm not gonna have one for the foreseeable future. Like I've the past year I took some contracts offered to me, and so that worked out relatively well for me, but like I have health issues such that I can't work, and I don't have an income, right? So I need to like I work hard, and I try to produce things of value, but it's not valued in our current economy, even the economy of public discourse, let's say the attentional economy, like, because these ideas are kind of a little bit, over the event horizon, because I think the next decade, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think I know what should happen,
Mhm.
which is a global scale collaborative project that includes demilitarization, or else it's not even going to work. And then so you free up a lot of money. We also have to flip some ideological switches like MMT, which you've mentioned at different points, and so it frees up the resources, but we have to have that consensus about what to do with those resources, because every time there's a stimulus package or whatever, it's just a massive kind of theft or grift. A lot of it is going to the top tier, and those people don't need the money, they don't deserve the money, and it's certainly not good for the economy itself.
Yeah.
So we're sort of accelerating into this collapse, when what we need to be doing is along the lines of what Benjamin Bratton proposes, and I'm proposing. I worked on this Smart Cities book over the past year, and many other sources kind of advocate for this 10 to 15 year window that we're now in. We're already in it, where we have a deadline on climate change, and there's really no future for war or conflict in that regard. Right. So we need to invest in people, in public education, in UBI, right? So, because for someone like me, that's like a direct, like, appropriate solution, right? But for everybody, it's going to have different effects, and it needs to be, we need to figure out exactly how it works, so it's not means tested, but it's also not like equally distributed to everybody, like, so it has to actually like lift the floor, and
Right.
donut economics, puts this pretty simply, like you have a kind of social floor and an ecological ceiling, right? And then you do economics within that kind of closed system, if you will.
Hmm.
But what is stopping us from even starting on that path, right? Because Bernie Sanders would have helped start us on that path. What is stopping us is the the pearl clutching, and people wanting to believe in but not have to defend their politics or their lack of politics. So if there is such a thing as a post politics or a post left, for me it's this unity project, right? And only the contemporary socialist left is kind of fit to lead that. That's where the sane people are.
Hmm.
So building consensus around that is one thing, and then also, like, the other two like wings of politics, so to speak, like the traditional left and right, they have to reform, right? If they want to continue to exist, continue to have a role in public life, whether it's George Bush or Tony Blair or Barack Obama, like, you need to get on our side. You need, because this is the kind of the will of the global masses, right? This is the voice of alter globalization, and this is the cry of the oppressed, and the Gaia itself demanding to be heard. And then we need a climate change resilience plan, like one of your notes in your essay that I read was about like the ice age, right? And I think about that a lot, because like before the ice age ended, the planet was very different, and it was a cataclysmic event such that it wiped out lots of people, lots of quote unquote civilization of the time. And so we don't know necessarily, like, are we going to face an ice age? Are we going to have a kind of like scorched earth kind of situation? But all resources and all productivity needs to be mobilized towards that kind of resilience and kind of global cosmopolitan ethics and consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I hear the notion or the term post work, what I think of is that it means work as in people will not be in a situation where they need to sell their labor, where first of all they're alienated from their own labor and they need to sell it to a boss or to an owner, a capitalist. but rather people's labor becomes something that they are able to freely to offer in service to the community and in service to the life of the whole Earth community ultimately. So it's a movement beyond work as the alienation of labor to not self-ownership of our own labor power. I think that's still thinking in the old terms, but more like a sense of not being alienated from our productive power. Capitalism
Yeah.
alienates us from our own productive power, and if we can become reintegrated with that power,
Yeah.
then we can participate with one another in creating some really beautiful things. I mean, the worlds that become possible when people wake
Yeah.
up to their own creative power
Yeah.
boggle the imagination.
Those are good points, and I have to hop on another call, but I want to
Mm-hmm.
leave you with a point on that point, which is, I can think of what you just said in kind of two ends of a spectrum. One is, people like us are like connected to our work of high abstraction and philosophy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very high form of productivity, for lack of a better word, where it's dependent on other people. The utility of it is not immediately apparent. It has very little exchange value, or none really. Like, because my work has zero exchange value, But the other end of the spectrum is like, hands-on kind of artisan stuff. So like pottery, and pottery is like one of those things, like, that, like, lots of people do for different reasons, but kind of in the contemporary sense, like yuppies are attracted to it because it's like this kind of, just, kind of primitive cultural
Yeah, I was
kind
going
of
to say that
practice.
they reconnect with the primal human
Yeah.
artistic instinct.
But my point is going to be here, like, if we have UBI and we have education that enables both of those things, both of those ends of the spectrum, like, because someone's not going to necessarily go out and teach themselves pottery, especially if they don't have the time, if they're a wage slave. So the type of world we're advocating is that the person can be connected to their work rather than alienated from it, whether you're shaping a pot with your hands or whether you're typing your manifesto on the computer, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And they both enable that income and education and kind of and support. Because what we don't want is just like, to give people free money and then them to continue to live kind of debased lives, be hyper consumers and be
Right.
like just ideologues of capitalism. So yeah, that's the direction we have to go in.
Yeah. No, I like that. I appreciate that. And I won't hold you up. I hope that we can continue the conversation sometime soon. And
Yeah, thanks.
I've really enjoyed this.
Right on. Me
Lots
too.
to think with. And yeah, thanks for stirring up some great ideas.
Right on. Likewise. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Talk to you later, Brent.